Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you're interested in Australian true crime and you love a stranger than fiction case, then consider subscribing. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. So I know I've been MIA for a little bit, I've had a few things going on here lately, none of which I'm going to bore you with. Suffice to say, I am back and I am ready to get into some truly crazy true crime cases with you all. And today's case is wild. We're talking about what was known in Australia as the case of the walking corpse. It's also been known as the Knack man, or alternatively Sydney's Mutilation Murders. So, fair warning, it will involve mutilation. It will also involve sexual assault and mental illness, so if that's not what you're here for, no problem at all, maybe just skip this one. When John McCarthy, a local mail sorter for the Postmaster General, was walking down George Street in Sydney on the 22nd of April 1963, he saw a man walking past him in the opposite direction. He knew this man, he used to work with this man, and he hadn't seen him for about 7 months. But McCarthy couldn't actually believe that it was really him, and so he began to follow him. McCarthy called out to his old work colleague Allan Edward Brennan. He called out a few times before Brennan finally stopped. McCarthy asked how he was, and Brennan said he was fine. But Brennan had noticed the shocked look on McCarthy's face when he had turned to greet him, and he asked McCarthy why he'd been so startled to see him. McCarthy told him why, and then Brennan seemed to leave very quickly, walking right into oncoming traffic, almost being hit by multiple cars in the process. The reason that John McCarthy had been so rattled at seeing Allan Brennan is because Allan Brennan was dead. His body had been found underneath his shop and home months beforehand, and police had concluded that Brennan had taken his own life. McCarthy had even organised a collection of work to purchase a wreath to place at the headstone at Brennan's funeral. He had just seen and spoken to a dead man. McCarthy went to the local police station to report what had happened, but they just assumed that he was drunk and told him to go home and sober up before coming back in the morning. McCarthy did just that, but when he returned the next day, the police still didn't believe him. It was only when McCarthy actually decided to call a crime reporter, Joe Morris, at the Mirror, a local newspaper, that people started to take him seriously. One of Joe's colleagues, Bill Jenkins, had heard the same story from another source, and so the Mirror's editor, Ian Smith, decided that they were going to run it. It ran under the headlines, "Dead Man Seen Walking in the City," and "The Case of the Walking Corpse." The police finally had to take notice of the incredible story about a man alive and well that they had ruled as dead months beforehand. The subsequent investigation into this walking corpse would take police in a direction that no one expected, and it would help them solve one of the most gruesome serial murder cases that Sydney had ever seen, the Mutilation Murders. The man that had been buried in a grave marked Allan Edward Brennan was not, in fact, Allan Brennan, and to make matters even more confusing, neither was the man that McCarthy had met in the street. That man's real name was William MacDonald. So who was William MacDonald? Why was he known as Allan Brennan? And why did everyone seem to think he was dead when he obviously wasn't? Well, for the answers to all of those questions, and to explain how this chance sighting of MacDonald led to solving the Mutilation Murders, we have to go back to the beginning. William MacDonald was born on the 17th of June 1924 in Liverpool, England, and he was born Allen Ginsberg. Yeah, William MacDonald wasn't his real name either. He was born into a wealthy Orthodox Jewish family, the second son after his older brother Michael, and he would end up being the middle of three once his younger brother Jeffrey was born. His parents, Daniel and Henrietta Ginsberg, had inherited their wealth from Daniel's parents, Aaron and Margaret, who had emigrated from Russia in 1970 and opened a furniture shop. The store rapidly became successful, and Aaron expanded the offering into musical instruments, mainly pianos at the time, and then as technology caught up, eventually record players and radiograms. Daniel Ginsberg joined his father in business, and Ginsberg and Son wholesale cabinet makers and bedding manufacturers became incredibly successful. It ended up covering 3 shop fronts, and the name eventually became the Piano Galleries. When Allan was born, he was actually named after his grandfather Aaron, but when the name is translated to English from Hebrew, it becomes Allan. While Michael and Jeffrey seemed to be well-adjusted children, Allan was known to be very antisocial. He didn't want to mix with any other children at daycare or school, and would not speak to anyone unless he absolutely had to. He said that one of his earliest memories was being scared to death when his mother took him to kindergarten when he was 4 years old. He said he wasn't sure if it was just the fear of being alone for the first time that made something in his mind snap, or if it had been like that before he was put in kindergarten. But he knew from the minute his mother walked away that he was not going to have anything to do whatsoever with any of the other children. When any of the other kids spoke to him, he would simply walk away without replying, and the more he kept doing this, the more the other kids stopped trying. They stopped trying to speak to him or trying to get him involved in any of their activities altogether. He had no friends, played with absolutely no one, and also spoke to no one. And he preferred it that way. He said, quote, "It was as if I was in a different world from everyone else. I was always daydreaming, and as a result my grades were atrocious. I have no idea why I was antisocial, and I suppose I was too little to even try to understand, but I wasn't unhappy either." He liked being alone, he liked not interacting with anyone, and he would stay that way his entire life. His kindergarten teacher, Miss Harrison, reported to his mother that Allan was unsociable and backward, and that he had no connection with society, and would most likely need special tuition and guidance for the rest of his life. Allan Ginsberg, or William MacDonald as he would later be known, recalled that while his mother was very elegant and classy and very kind to animals, she had no real love for her children, and especially none for him. His father Daniel was too busy with his business affairs, socializing, and poker games to pay much attention to him either. It said that his mother knew of his developmental and social problems, and instead of trying to help her son, would berate him, would pick on him, often referring to him as the idiot son in front of guests that would frequently visit their home. Whether it was the group of ladies that would come over for afternoon or morning tea, or the bridge club that his mother was a part of. Allan grew to enormously dislike his mother and found it very hard to communicate with her, but he did love her. But he would end up believing that no one ever truly loved him, and because of that he would never really know how to love anyone else. He knew he was very different from his brothers, who were both very likable, they both excelled in their studies, and it seemed that their father had much higher expectations of them. He fought with his brothers regularly, and he couldn't understand why, at that age, he hated them so much. All he knew was that he did. He hated them and he hated their friends, and so his brothers as well learnt very quickly to just leave him alone, and again, that's just the way he wanted it. He just wanted to be by himself. In 1932, Allan left the kindergarten and moved on to the Liverpool Institute, one of the best schools in the area. It was the hope of his parents that by sending him to a top school it would help him become a better student and hopefully allow him to make friends. But that was not the case. Allan suffered from bouts of depression and severe headaches, and he did very poorly at school. He developed a reputation as the school dunce, and he was mercilessly bullied. He didn't seem to care, though. He simply retreated into his imagination. In his own words, quote, "I could escape by going off into my own little world in my mind." His grades were terrible, and mainly because he never studied. At 4 p.m, when the school day was finished, all of the other kids went home to do their homework, and Allan would head down to the local cinema with the pocket money that his mother would give him. And he was only interested in one genre: crime. Now, money was never a problem. His mother gave him 5 shillings a week, and the price of a movie ticket was a 6pence, which means he could see 10 films a week if he really wanted to. The problem for Allan was actually getting in. The films he wanted to see contained high amounts of violence and gore, and minors weren't allowed to see them without a parent or guardian present. So, he would wait at the entrance to the theatre and ask people coming in if he could pretend to be with them. He found that this worked very well and would do it almost every day. Crime movies fascinated and enthralled little Allen Ginsberg. He said, quote, "I couldn't get enough of them. I loved the violence, people shooting, stabbing, and killing each other violently. The bloodier, the better." His favourite film was the 1932 movie I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, a film that was almost stopped from being made completely because the Warner Brothers story department felt that it was too violent and morbid to get past the censorship board. Side note, it actually ended up being nominated for 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. But Allen Ginsberg went to see the film more times than he could count. He was also obsessed with magazines like Crimes and Punishment, which was a weekly true crime publication. He would lock himself in his bedroom and read the stories, captivated by the ways in which people murdered each other. And I know that that might sound a little hypocritical or contradictory, because obviously there are a lot of people that enjoy true crime, and I'm obviously one of them. But I'm also not 8 years old, and I don't go on to do the things that Allen Ginsberg did. He loved reading about death and the macabre, and even went so far to say that his personal hero, the person he admired above anyone else in the world, was Jack the Ripper. Allen's schoolwork deteriorated to the point that he was kept in the same grade at school for 5 years. He remained in the same class from the age of 8 to the age of 13. Although his escape from school, other people, and being made fun of for being held back so often was violent, bloody movies and magazines about murder and death, he was never really a violent child, except on one occasion where he got into a fist fight with another boy who had picked on him far more than the others. He had to be pulled off the other boy by multiple teachers, and he said himself that he'd gone into an absolutely uncontrollable rage. His teachers and the school principal were concerned not only about his behaviour, but about how far he had fallen behind the rest of the children his age. They had sent home reports and letters to his parents, but his mother took very little notice of his schoolwork, or lack thereof, until the headmaster, Mr. Edwards, personally visited her at home. He told her that they'd tried to get Allan to socialise, to come out of his shell, to play sport, or even just to interact with the other children, but nothing had helped. He told Henrietta Ginsberg that in his opinion there was something wrong inside Allan's head, and that her best option was to seek medical help, because there was nothing more the teachers could do. Mrs. Ginsberg took her son to see Dr. Barton Hall, a leading Liverpool psychiatrist. Allan told him about the headaches that he'd been suffering from for years, and how, even though he'd been prescribed a large amount of aspirin and a special diet by doctors, those headaches had never gone away. He also described to Dr. Barton Hall his feelings of depression, and the world that he retreated to, the one in his mind, was a very dark and gloomy place. that he never laughed, and that he took everything very seriously, even as a small child. Dr. Barton Hall would end up diagnosing Allen Ginsberg as a schizophrenic. Allen Ginsberg would end up seeing this doctor twice a week for a year. Dr. Barton Hall worked with him to try and get to the subconscious level, trying to understand his behaviour. But after a year, in 1937, the doctor concluded that Allan was a highly unusual boy and that there was no more that he could do to help. He recommended to Allan's mother that she remove him from the Liverpool Institute and send him somewhere else. And as if he wasn't being made fun of enough before, his mother, not really knowing or caring what was happening to him, spoke to his old kindergarten teacher, Miss Harrison, and organised to send her 14-year-old son back to kindergarten, when no other child was older than 8. Allan stayed at that kindergarten until 1939, the year the Second World War started. He was 15 and he'd learnt how to read and write, but not a lot else. He decided that he was done with school and that there was nothing else there for him, so told his parents that he was going to leave and get a job. His parents seemed to care very little about what he did, and that didn't change when he dropped out of school. Well, dropped out of kindergarten. He ended up joining the Clerks Association, a group that was charged with finding work for people. And this is when Allen Ginsberg added lying to his arsenal of skills. He lied on his application to the Clerks Association to become a rent collector, saying that he'd previously done that job. He would have to go door to door, collecting rent payments from impoverished, destitute tenants, and deliver the payments to the landlords. He was very often verbally abused when he knocked on the door, as the people that he was trying to collect from didn't even have enough money to feed their families, let alone money to pay their rent. It only took 8 days before Allan was let go for not being able to collect any money. Through more lies, he was able to get another job as a junior clerk with a wholesale chemist. The problem with that job is that as a clerk, he was expected to look after some of the books and do some of the accounting. But because the extent of his schooling had been reading and writing, he was unable to figure out even the simplest of equations. He couldn't do any math. So the company took him off that job and offered him a position labouring with the actual chemicals. All in all, he lasted 3 weeks before he was let go. He decided to go and work for his father in the furniture and piano store as a cleaner, and he managed to keep this job for a couple of years, partly because he never ended up looking for any other work, partly because he was family, but mostly because he actually began to enjoy it. Being in the piano store afforded him music lessons. He learnt to play the piano, and he actually developed a love of classical music, which incidentally had been his mother's favourite. He always dressed very well, he kept his appearance really neat, but he was also very aware that he really didn't know anything, except what he'd read and seen in crime books and movies. He knew that there was something different about him, that he wasn't the same as everyone else. He believed at the time that he wasn't physically or mentally ill, just that he wasn't good at anything and that he was different. His older brother Michael had joined the Air Force and become a fighter pilot, and his younger brother had joined him in working in the family business. Allan decided that he needed a change and he wanted to become a fighter pilot like his older brother. Perhaps he thought it would make his parents proud, but because he had never obtained his high school certificate, the British Air Force could not accept him. So instead, he chose to apply to the Lancashire Fusiliers, a line infantry division of the British Army. He did disclose his medical history and his diagnosis, but because he didn't have any criminal record, he was immediately accepted and was sent to the training barracks near the Scottish border. His family, especially his father, thought that joining the army would be good for him. It would, in his words, make a man out of him. Allen Ginsberg hated the barracks and the training. As soon as he was sent to the training, he gave up any personal space, and he had to share his living quarters and bathroom with a number of other soldiers. He was used to being alone most of the time and was not used to having to interact with such a large amount of people. It was cold and he was miserable, but he somehow managed to get through the 6 months of training that he was required to complete. Now, he had only been in the Fusiliers for a very short time when something happened to him that would change the course of his life forever. Allen Ginsberg was lured into an empty air raid shelter and raped by his superior officer, a 45-year-old corporal who'd been a career soldier, a man by the name of Alexander Rice. Rice told Allen that if he ever told anyone about the assault that he would kill him, and Allen believed him. It was a horrific and traumatizing experience, and he was not only scared, but he was also confused. He was around 19 or 20 at the time, but he knew nothing about sex. He'd never even felt sexual attraction before, towards women or men. Allen Ginsberg was shocked and bewildered by what Rice had done to him. He had never imagined that anything like that could happen, or that men like Alexander Rice had actually existed. It happened once, which is one time too many, and then 3 weeks later Rice was transferred overseas and Allen Ginsberg would never see him again, at least not in person. He eventually came to believe that being raped by his superior officer was the catalyst for having future relationships with men. He knew deep down that he was gay, but he was content to never act on it. Homosexuality was illegal in England at the time, and would continue to be for another 20 years. He assumed that one day he would marry a woman and have a family. He didn't know how that would happen, considering he had never spoken to anyone and didn't like interacting with people, but he just thought that that's how life went, and that's how it would go for him too. Despite being sexually abused in his first year in the Fusiliers, he would spend a total of 5 years serving. He initially signed up for the duration of the war, but when it ended in 1945, he felt like the army was helping him. He had stopped having the migraines and headaches, and it was teaching him discipline, so he remained there for another 2 years, mainly assigned to light duties, standing guard and assisting with deliveries. He left the army in 1947, and while the non-commissioned officer, or NCO, reported that his behaviour was unusual and that he didn't associate with any of the other men, he was simply considered eccentric, and he was discharged as an honest, sober, and reliable soldier. He made his way back home. His time in the army didn't seem to have any effect on the way his parents treated him. They treated it as if he'd never really been away and spent very little time with him even once he'd returned from service. Now, there wasn't a lot of work in his hometown when he'd come home, so he took a coal mining position in Newcastle-on-Tyne, about 4 hours away from Liverpool, and he worked the mines for about 6 months before accessing a government grant available to ex-servicemen to be able to attend college. Due to his previous lessons in piano, his family's business, and his love of classical music, he decided to study at the Rushworth and Drapers Tobias Mathey Private College of Music in Liverpool, where he studied and learnt piano, cello, organ, and violin. It was the first time in Allen Ginsberg's life that he had excelled in school. He had a natural ability for musical instruments and a love of playing. And it was at college that he began to go on very long walks, walking through the towns and out into the countryside for hours and hours at a time. It wasn't just the stress and pressure of college that caused Allen Ginsberg to want to walk alone for miles and think. He'd also begun, for the first time in his life, to have sexual urges. After classes, he would study, and then between the hours of 7 p.m. and midnight, he started to lurk around hotels and public toilets, waiting for men to approach him to initiate a sexual encounter. He would never approach anyone or initiate anything himself because he knew that there were plainclothes police on duty and he could face up to 20 years in prison. The police, however, had seen him roaming in the streets at night quite regularly, and they did suspect that he may be having liaisons with other men, but they had never caught him. One night, a woman called police and claimed that Ginsberg was using foul language, was swearing at her. Police questioned him and he denied it, but he was unable to provide an alibi or defend himself because at the time he was supposed to have been harassing this woman, he was having a sexual encounter with another man, which was a much bigger offense. The police ended up calling Allan's younger brother Jeffrey and told him that something needed to be done about his brother. He was wandering the streets at night, so they were going to have to arrest him and lock him up if Jeffrey didn't do something. And Jeffrey decided that, well, the best course of action is just to have you locked in a psychiatric hospital. He told Allan that he'd had him committed to the Crichton Mental Institution in Scotland, and that if he didn't go willingly, Jeffrey was going to have the police come and take him. Allan hesitantly agreed, bearing in mind that this committal was based solely on the fact that he was walking the streets at night. Hardly a reason to lock someone up in a mental institution. But Allan didn't fight it and didn't necessarily want to be dragged there in handcuffs. He said the facility was a living hell on earth. It was a huge stone brick castle that was bitterly cold, filled with hundreds of patients that were usually locked up in cramped cells and kept solitary except for meals or treatment. For 6 months, Allan Ginsberg was treated there, and I use the word treated very loosely. He received some medication and sedation for his schizophrenia, but what he also received was high-voltage electric shock treatment, administered through electrodes in his head and chest. For 6 months, Allan received this treatment 5 days a week. It was unbearably painful, gave him excruciating headaches, and if he resisted leaving his cell for the treatment, guards would drag him by the arms to the doctors. So in the end, he just learnt not to resist. He never spoke to anyone for the entire time that he was there, except the doctors and only whenever necessary. He never associated with any of the other patients, but he hated the whole experience. He ended up contemplating whether or not to kill someone just so he'd be transferred to a prison instead. He wrote to his mother regularly, pleading with her to get him out of there. She told him that Jeffrey had wanted to keep him there so that he couldn't further embarrass the family, but he kept writing to her, telling her that he thought the institution was just making things worse for him and that he needed to escape. Henrietta Ginsberg eventually went to the authorities and told them that her son was not insane and should be released. Because she was his mother, there was nothing stopping her from removing Allan from the facility herself. So she did. After 6 months, Allan Ginsberg was released, but the effects of his treatment would continue to impact his life for a long time. He spent 3 months at home before deciding to pack up and move to Canada with the money that he'd saved from the army and his mining job. He thought he could have a new life there, a fresh start. Liverpool was full of bad memories for him and bad experiences, and so he caught a plane to Toronto. He quickly realised that there was little to no work in Toronto, so he boarded a bus and made the 6-hour journey to Montreal, but job prospects were no better there than they had been when he'd landed in Canada. After only a few weeks, Allan Ginsberg was homeless. He'd used up the money that he had brought with him, he had no job, and was surviving on handouts from the local Salvation Army. He did have a bank account back in England, but his pride would not allow him to contact his mother and ask her to withdraw it and send it to him. Instead, he slept on park benches and ate at soup kitchens for an entire year. In 1950, the Salvation Army took it upon themselves to contact his mother, and she sent Allan Ginsberg the money that he needed to return home. When he came home, his brother Geoffrey took every opportunity to make fun of him for being a failure in Canada, and it depressed him so much that his mother eventually took him back to the psychiatrist he'd seen as a boy. This time he was given the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and was prescribed antidepressants. Allen Ginsberg took them without question. They made him feel better, and he thought that they were helping. Even with the new diagnosis and medication, he knew something else needed to change. He decided, without telling any of his family, to go to Leeds and have his name legally changed. He didn't know why he'd chosen the name William MacDonald, nor why he didn't want a middle name, but it seemed right to him. He also got a nose job at around the same time. He had originally inherited his father's nose. He called it, quote, huge and very Jewish. He hated his nose and the link that it created between himself and his father. While his family obviously immediately noticed the nose job, they had no idea that he'd done away with the family name. He went back to the family business as a cleaner, and for 4 years he worked and saved whatever money he could. He still continued to roam the streets at night, having casual sex with men in public toilets and other hidden places. He had a new name and a new face, but felt that most other things had stayed the same. He hated his brothers, he didn't much like his parents, and as far as he could tell, they felt the same way about him. In 1954, he applied to emigrate to Australia. He had a passport in the name of William MacDonald, he had some money saved, and he had a promise of a job building a dam in Mackay in North Queensland. He sailed to Australia on the Orcades, a passenger liner, for a price of £10. He was required to share a cabin with 3 other people, which he found horrible, but it was no worse than being in the army. The liner stopped in Fremantle, Adelaide, and Port Melbourne before finally arriving in Brisbane, where the now William no middle name MacDonald took a train to Mackay. William MacDonald arrived in Mackay on the 11th of December 1954 and did end up getting the job working on the dam. The country and his new job was not what he expected. Housing was small cabins at the construction site, which he compared to a prison cell. There were no showers, and mosquitoes and flies swarmed the town. What he was most unprepared for, though, was the weather. Growing up in Liverpool, England, in December it was winter, and the average temperature was around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, or around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas in Australia, December is summer, and the temperature in Mackay averages around 30 degrees Celsius, or about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference in the average temperatures shocked MacDonald, and he lasted about 3 weeks before he again felt the need to escape. So he caught the train to Adelaide in South Australia, a 26-hour journey. The weather in Adelaide was much milder, and he settled in the city in a single room of a boarding house in College Park, and got a little casual work. Things seemed to be finally going well for William MacDonald, until his sexual urges returned, and this time they came back with urgency. On the 18th of April 1955, at about 9:30 at night, William MacDonald approached a man in a public toilet. It seemed like this man had been waiting for this kind of encounter, so MacDonald began to touch him in the groin. Unfortunately, this man was a decoy, an undercover police officer, and MacDonald was arrested and charged with 2 counts of gross indecency and indecent assault on a male person. He was unable to pay any bail, which meant he was kept in lockup until his case was heard. He spent 8 weeks in prison, so he'd lost his job and he'd lost his room at the boarding house. His case was eventually heard, and he was let out on bond on the condition that he submit for psychiatric treatment. William MacDonald would not present for treatment, though. He was scared that he would again be institutionalised just like he had been in Liverpool. So, completely ignoring the court order, he fled to Melbourne, where he spent a couple of months as a labourer before then taking off to Perth. In Perth, William MacDonald decided that he would start going by a different name. He never officially changed it, so I'll continue to refer to him as William MacDonald, but he flicked through the phone book and randomly selected the name Allan Edward Brennan. He spent 2 years in Perth working as a labourer on a railway station, but he had also stopped taking his medication, and he was becoming increasingly paranoid. His mental state was declining rapidly, but he managed to keep this to himself. He never interacted with anyone still, and he continued to walk the streets at night. He imagined that everyone he worked with was making fun of him behind his back because of his sexuality, but in reality, nobody even knew his preference or really anything about him. He'd now been working in physical labour for years. He ate a very healthy and balanced diet, and he continually walked for hours at night time, so he was extremely physically fit and strong. And he was aggressive. He was not afraid to throw a punch, and after 2 years he was fired for repeatedly fighting with his colleagues. In 1957, William MacDonald's father died of stomach cancer, and his mother wrote to him to give him the news. It barely affected him. He said, quote, "I don't really know how I felt when I read that he was dead. I don't think it was sad. It was more like a nothingness. I don't think it meant anything to me." He left Perth that year and moved to Hobart in Tasmania, where he continued working as a labourer on the railway, on and off, for another couple of years. During this time, his mental health became worse. He became more angry at the world around him and began to have fantasies about stabbing someone to death. And that's when the voice started. He could feel anger building up inside of him, and a voice inside his head started urging him to kill someone. He had moved regularly to try to escape what he called the demon in his mind, trying to convince him to commit murder. But no matter where he went, it remained in his head, getting worse by the day. He kept on the move, attempting to outrun this demon. He went to Sydney and spent a short time there before heading across the Tasman to New Zealand in August of 1959. He got another labourer's job, but his paranoia was only getting worse. He was fired after only a month. He thought that the foreman had been mocking him behind his back, so as revenge, he poured cement all over him. He was immediately fired. Late that same year, he moved back to Brisbane into a rented room in a boarding house in the city. He worked casual labouring jobs during the day, and at night, his hobbies had expanded from just walking around at night to buying and reading books about murder. About once a month, he would have what he called a dalliance with random men around the city. He had these urges every few weeks. The voice in his head was still telling him to kill, and it was becoming louder and more persistent. He decided that he would finally act on it. Not long after he'd moved back to Brisbane, he went out and bought a small pocket knife. Later that same night, he went for one of his walks. He saw a man he didn't know and grabbed him. He dragged this man into a doorway and used the small knife to stab the man in the neck. As he stabbed the man, he heard someone approaching, so he let go of his victim, who took the opportunity to run. MacDonald also fled and quickly got rid of the knife. He expected the attack to be featured in the newspapers the next day, but evidently he had not hurt the stranger enough for him to have reported the incident. Nothing was in any of the local papers about the stabbing. MacDonald was disappointed, and he realised that he'd been hoping to read about what he had done. He wanted the attention. To him, it was a replacement for the attention that he had never received as a child. He considered that that was likely the reason that he'd actually done it in the first place. He lay low for a little while. He'd come very close to being caught, and he was determined to make sure that that didn't happen. He decided that next time he would be more careful. Every day the voice in his head, his demon, got louder and the urge to kill got stronger. It was the 19th of March 1960 when William MacDonald could no longer resist. He went out for a walk in the evening, and at about 6:30 p.m. he was passing the Roma Street train station when he saw a man struggling to get enough coins together to pay for a pie. MacDonald pulled a roll of notes from his pocket and offered to pay for the man's food. The man, 63-year-old Amos Hugh Hurst, accepted gratefully, and he accompanied MacDonald to a nearby park bench to sit and eat. MacDonald began drinking from a bottle of beer that he had brought with him in his bag, and he shared this bottle with Hurst, and told Hurst that he had another 3 bottles in the bag. He told this man that he'd be happy to share the beer with him, but they should probably go somewhere more private in case there were police around who might charge them for drinking in public. Amos Hurst readily agreed and told MacDonald that his place actually wasn't far from where they were, so they might as well go there. On the way, Hurst told MacDonald about himself. He told him that he was a currently unemployed labourer, that he had no wife, no children, and not really any friends. He lived on benefits and got by with a little help every now and again from his mother. As they neared Hurst's apartment, MacDonald was careful. He made sure that no one saw them as they went inside. Hurst sat on his bed and MacDonald sat in a chair and watched while Hurst drank from the bottles and smoked cigarettes. MacDonald only had a couple of very small glasses of beer, wanting to remain alert, but watching happily as Amos Hurst began to get very drunk. MacDonald felt the urges inside get stronger until he couldn't control himself. He stood up from the chair and wrapped his hands around Amos Hurst's neck. He began to strangle him. He said, quote, "It felt good to have power over him." Hurst cried out for MacDonald to stop what he was doing, and he tried to pry MacDonald's hands from around his neck, but he was no match for the physically stronger, younger, and more determined William MacDonald. Then, according to MacDonald, a strange thing happened. He looked down into Hurst's face as he strangled him to death, and saw the face of Alexander Rice, the corporal who had raped him in the air raid shelter in his first year of the army. MacDonald felt a surge of uncontrollable hatred and flew into a rage, strangling Hurst harder and harder until he felt his body go limp in his hands. He continued to throttle him well after he was certain that the man was dead, and he said afterwards that he regretted not having his knife so that he could have hurt Alexander Rice even more, even though this man was not Alexander Rice. After he had killed Amos Hurst, he slumped to the floor, exhausted. The demon in his head had left him, being satisfied by the murder. MacDonald said that he felt sorry he had killed Hurst, but he'd also enjoyed doing it very much. He was also scared. He didn't want to get caught. He thought that if he undressed the body and put it in the bed under the covers, then maybe people would think that he had died of natural causes. He staged the body and gathered up the bottles of beer and anything else that might have pointed to another person being inside the apartment that night. He checked outside to make sure that no one was watching, and then snuck away into the night. He checked the papers every day to see if there was any mention of the murder that he had committed, but there was nothing. There was no mention of murder or strangulation. It was 5 days later that he saw a funeral notice in the local Courier Mail newspaper. It had worked. He'd gotten away with it. MacDonald couldn't believe that he hadn't been caught, and he actually rang the funeral home pretending to be an old friend, inquiring about Amos Hurst's death. He was told that 3 days after he'd murdered him, the poor man had been found in his bed, and it was ruled that he'd died of a heart attack. That day, the 22nd of March, Mrs. Kickbush, Hurst's landlady, noticed a strange smell coming from his apartment. She also realized that she hadn't seen him in a few days. She sent a messenger across the road to Rupert Mitchell's home, a friend of hers, and asked him to come and investigate, fearing that her tenant might be dead. He looked through the window above the door but could only see something that was rolled up under the bed covers. He forced the door open and approached the bed, where he saw what looked like it could be a man's body underneath the blankets. Although it was strange that the covers had been tucked in over the head. Mitchell's priority was to see what it was or who it was. He lifted the mass to untuck the covers and found the body of Amos Hurst. The face and head were black and bloated, and the rest of the body was going the same way. He called the police and Constable Glenn McCallum arrived on the scene. There didn't seem to be any suspicious circumstances, and a post-mortem conducted the next day concluded that Amos Hurst died of a heart attack in his sleep. The intense discoloration of the face and neck may have hidden any bruises or marks from the strangulation and had allowed the killer to get away with murder. MacDonald was extremely relieved that the police weren't going to come knocking on his door for murder anytime soon, and he began to prepare for the next time the voice in his head, his demon, wanted him to kill again. He went out and bought a long-bladed sheath knife and began again to prowl the streets for his next victim. It was only weeks after he had killed Amos Hurst that he met a man named Bill in a wine bar. He bought the war veteran some drinks, and they walked to a nearby park to share a bottle of sherry that MacDonald had brought with him. When Bill passed out drunk on the grass, MacDonald's urge to kill became overwhelming. MacDonald kneeled over Bill and raised the knife above his chest. He said he could feel the demon in a rage inside him, but as he lifted the knife higher, getting ready to plunge it into Bill's neck, the urge suddenly left him. He stayed motionless with the knife held above the man, but he no longer had the impulse to kill him. He put the knife back in its sheath and left what he called the world's luckiest wino to sleep it off. The next day, he threw the knife into the Brisbane River. On the 29th of October 1960, MacDonald yet again had the urge to kill. He was walking around Brisbane through the night and early into the next morning when he saw a man asleep inside a telephone box. He opened the phone booth door, pulled out a small knife from his pocket, and stabbed the man twice in the back of the neck while he slept. Although he had planned to kill someone and carry out a far more violent attack, after stabbing the man twice and only superficially, the demon in his head had abated and the urge to kill suddenly left him again. He fled, hoping he hadn't been seen. When Rodney Smith awoke on the 30th of October, he felt a sharp pain in his neck and realized that his shirt was stained with blood. He went to a local store and had them call for police and an ambulance, and he was taken to the hospital, where it was confirmed that he'd been stabbed twice in the back of the neck. The injuries weren't serious enough for him to be admitted, and he had no idea who had done it or why. William MacDonald had once again escaped being caught. He decided that it was probably time to move on from Brisbane, but not before he actually managed to kill someone else. His demon wasn't quite satisfied. Only days after the attempt on Roland Smith's life, he began to walk along North Quay until he saw a man leaning against a wall, looking like he'd been drinking. MacDonald told the stranger that he had a couple of bottles of beer in his bag if the man would like to share them with him. The man agreed and they walked down to the water's edge. While they were drinking, MacDonald suddenly punched the man in the face and then put his hands around the man's neck and began to strangle him. The man began to struggle and scream, and MacDonald got scared, afraid that he was going to get caught, and this seemed to cause the urge, the compulsion to kill, to leave him again. He quickly let go of the man and grabbed the 2 beer bottles that they'd been drinking from and put them back in his bag. He then left the man gasping for air on the grass by the water and ran back up the embankment. William MacDonald moved to Sydney in early November of 1960. He continued using the assumed name of Allan Edward Brennan. He rented a room on the second floor of a boarding house. It was quiet and clean, and he could wander in and out without hardly ever seeing another person, which is exactly what he wanted. He was only a very short walk from numerous bars, hotels, parks, and public toilets, which were also frequented by many of Sydney's homeless population. Effectively, for MacDonald, it was a hunting ground. He spent his nights having dinner at a local Greek restaurant, reading his true crime magazines and listening to his classical music. He actually didn't drink very much at all, and mainly only used alcohol to lure his victims and to incapacitate them. He worked casual labouring jobs until he got a place in the YMCA mail sorting course, and this allowed him to secure a position in the Postmaster General's department. He maintained his casual outings for sexual companions, using nearby public toilets to not be seen by the authorities. Occasionally he visited bars and hotels looking for potential victims. Usually they were rough labourers that drank far too much, which meant they would offer little resistance and he could kill them quickly. But for a while he didn't act on this because the demon had temporarily left him and he had no urges to kill. He thought it might have been because he was content for the first time in his life. His job was relatively easy, and although he never associated with his co-workers and they just saw him as an eccentric loner, they seemed to accept him. It would be 6 months after he moved to Sydney that the demon came back, insisting that he kill again. On Saturday the 3rd of June 1961, he walked into a sporting store and asked to see their selection of knives. He purchased a large knife in a sheath. The blade was 25 centimeters or 10 inches long and 5 centimeters or 2 inches wide. He paid for the knife, put it in his bag, and walked out of the store. He planned this time. He walked out that same night in light showers. He wore warm clothing, and in his bag he carried beer, wine, his new knife, and a raincoat. He had scouted the area in the 6 months since he'd arrived in Sydney and had come to the conclusion that it would be much easier to murder someone here than it had been in Brisbane or New Zealand, because there was a much larger homeless population, which means he could make sure that his victims didn't have families to go home to or people that might be looking for them. He knew that the local parks would be the place that these men would head to after closing times at the bars and hotels. Just before 11 p.m. he found Alfred Greenfield sitting beneath a fig tree in Green Park. He struck up a conversation with him and found out that Alfred had had a fight with his lady friend and had drunk his sorrows away but had run out of money to buy any more alcohol. He was perfect for MacDonald's plan. He cheered up greatly when MacDonald produced a bottle of beer and shared it with him. MacDonald told him that there was more where that had come from, but that they should probably move from the public park to drink it because they could get arrested for drinking in public. Alfred told William MacDonald that he knew a place that they could go, the Domain Baths. As they spoke about their lives, Alfred sharing that he'd been in the army and MacDonald bonding with him by telling him about being in the Fusiliers, they moved into a shed at the baths under cover of the light rain. MacDonald got out his raincoat from his bag and put it on, and Alfred didn't question it. It was raining, and he was already quite intoxicated. MacDonald had hardly drunk anything. He wanted to keep his mind clear for what he was about to do. But it wasn't the rain that he was protecting himself from with the raincoat. As Alfred Greenfield went on drinking, William MacDonald slowly reached back into his bag and took his knife out of its sheath. His demon was screaming inside his head, getting louder and more insistent. He pulled the knife out of his bag, raised it above his head, and plunged it sideways into Alfred Greenfield's throat with as much force as he could. The blow knocked Alfred onto his side. The knife had gone through his throat and out the other side, but William MacDonald wasn't finished. He pulled the knife out and stabbed him again. Alfred had raised his hands, and the blade had deflected off one of them and nicked his jugular vein. MacDonald could feel blood spraying everywhere, hence the raincoat. At this point, after 2 deep and violent cuts to the throat, Alfred was still gurgling and struggling. MacDonald became furious that he was still alive. Alfred's hands had come up to grasp his throat where the knife had cut through, and MacDonald again plunged the knife in, this time going through Alfred's hand and into his Adam's apple. There was a little light coming from the moon through the shed roof, and when MacDonald looked down into the face of his victims, he once again saw the face of Alexander Rice. The vision of his rapist enraged him, and he completely lost control. He began furiously stabbing the man over and over again in the face, chest, and neck. He didn't care at this point if someone came in and saw what he was doing. He would just kill them too. He was enjoying it, and he would have been glad for someone to come along so he could get more pleasure out of the evening. He couldn't stop, and he even rolled Alfred over so that he could stab him through the back, shoulders, and the back of the neck. He knew Alfred was dead. He'd stabbed him 47 times, but he wasn't finished. He didn't see Alfred Greenfield when he looked down at the body. He could only see Alexander Rice, and he wanted to make sure that Rice would not be able to do to any more young men what he'd done to MacDonald, even in hell, which is surely where MacDonald had just sent him. He wiped the blood on his hands and knife on the raincoat that he was wearing, and then he rolled Alfred back onto his back. He removed Alfred's shoes and placed them next to the body, and then he removed the man's pants and underwear. He folded them neatly, placing them on top of his shoes. He was careful not to touch any solid surfaces that might leave any bloody fingerprints. He then used the knife to remove Alfred Greenfield's genitals and the surrounding flesh. He walked to the sea wall and threw the pieces of the body into the water as far as he could throw. He went back to the body, collected the beer bottles and put them in the bag. He then removed the blood-covered raincoat and put that in the bag along with the knife. The murder and mutilation of Alfred Greenfield had taken William MacDonald only 15 minutes. He was satisfied that he didn't have too much blood on his clothing, not enough to be suspicious anyway, and he left. As he walked home, he stopped at a tap and washed off his shoes. He washed his hands and face and dried them with his handkerchief. He was fairly certain that no one had seen him enter the domain baths with Alfred and that no one had seen him leave. He was home about half an hour after he'd brutally killed and mutilated an innocent stranger. He felt revolted, disgusted with himself at what he had done, but at the same time he had to admit to himself it had felt nice to get revenge on Alexander Rice. What he called his other personality reminded him that it wasn't Rice, it had been a complete stranger. He also told himself that it wasn't really him who'd done it, it was the demon, the part of himself that he couldn't control. Inside him was this conflict between this demon and his other personality. He promised himself that it wouldn't happen again, that this would be his last murder. The next morning, he walked Sydney Harbour. He had wrapped up the bloody raincoat and the knife along with a brick that he'd found in newspaper, and he threw it into the water. As he watched the package sink, he realized that he liked the power that killing someone had given him. He liked the control. He had never felt powerful before in his life, and so there had to be more murders. He would do it again. Alfred Greenfield was found at 7:30 a.m. and he was identified by his fingerprints. His brother, Roy Ernest Greenfield, went and visually identified him at the Sydney City Morgue. His de facto wife of 15 years, Mary Phyllis Baronia Wingo Greenfield, also viewed and identified Alfred. She told police that they had gone out to a hotel at about 8 p.m. and stayed until closing time, about 10. They had left the hotel and walked along Burke Street. While they walked, they had had an argument, and after handing her the keys to their apartment, he had stormed off towards Green Park, and that was the last time she had ever seen him before viewing his body in the morgue. Mary Phyllis told the officers that Alfred regularly went to the Domain baths to fish on the water's edge. She told them that Alfred was an honest and hard worker. He did drink, but he was never abusive, and that he didn't have an enemy in the world that she knew of. He would occasionally go out on drinking binges and would disappear for 1 or 2 days at a time. He would end up sleeping at a cheap motel or somewhere like the Domain. Later that day, police divers had begun searching the harbour for any sign of a murder weapon. As they searched the water, one of the divers noticed small fish congregating around something. When he brushed away the fish, he found himself looking at men's genitals, all connected by skin and hair. It wasn't in any sort of bag or container, it was just loose and sitting on the bottom of the harbour. He was horrified, but quickly composed himself to bring the gruesome discovery back to the investigating detectives. A very, very small article in that evening's newspaper described the murder as the most gruesome in Sydney's history, and although it didn't mention the full details of the mutilation of the body, by the next day, all of Sydney seemed to know about the removal of the man's genitals and about divers finding them in the water. William MacDonald was excited about the newspaper on Monday the 5th of June, hoping that this horrific act would be in bold print on the front page and he could read all about the murder in detail. He was therefore disappointed with how small the article actually was when that day's paper finally came, but at least it was on the front page. He hadn't actually seen the smaller article on the Sunday evening. At work, there was not too much mention of the murder, but some of the men made jokes about the discovery of the man's privates in the water. William MacDonald laughed alongside the men, trying not to seem suspicious, but he became very paranoid that they knew it had been him. The rest of his co-workers made no more mention of the murder though, and MacDonald began to feel more at ease. Alfred Greenfield's post-mortem was performed on the 7th of June, and it was ruled that he had died from massive blood loss from at least 3 stab wounds on the side of his neck. Dr. John Liang, director of the Division of Forensic Medicine, who performed the autopsy, concluded that whoever had committed the horrendous injuries to Greenfield, of which he had never seen before in his medical career, must have been in a state of absolute uncontrollable rage. The government of New South Wales offered a £1,000 reward for any information that led to the conviction of his killer. Over the next couple of months, MacDonald kept to himself, but he was becoming more and more paranoid that his co-workers were conspiring against him. He had a problem with one man in particular, Aubrey Belts, who he said continually tormented him, usually about being so distant and not associating with any of his colleagues. MacDonald ended up bringing a large knife to work one day and threatening to kill Belts if he didn't leave him alone. After even more alleged torment, MacDonald once snuck up behind Belts and was about to strangle him, when Belts turned, realizing that MacDonald was about to attack him, and slapped MacDonald across the face. MacDonald also brought a fake gun to work and threatened to shoot Belts, but Belts realized the gun was a fake and reported him to management. After the knife and gun incidents, MacDonald was sent to his boss's office, but his boss was sympathetic to the treatment that MacDonald was reporting from Belts, so he wasn't fired, but instead he was moved to alternating shifts so that the two men wouldn't have to work together anymore. Meanwhile, the leads on Alfred Greenfield's murder were few and far between, and police would eventually put it on the back burner. There was no evidence, there were no fingerprints, there was no jealous lover that might account for the brutal mutilation. Greenfield wasn't a part of any gangs or underworld crime organizations, and his partner, Mary, was right that he seemed to have no enemies. His murder was far from forgotten, but with no clues as to who might have done it, police needed to continue work on other cases. William MacDonald went about life as normal. He continued his monthly meetings with random men, loitering around men's public toilets until he was approached. This was enough to satisfy his sexual cravings, but his murderous cravings were growing rapidly. He had bought another knife from a gun store on George Street, a different store from where he'd purchased the first one. He didn't want there to be a connection between the knives. He liked how well the first one had worked, so he wanted to buy the exact same make and model. He knew now that he would continue to kill and mutilate until he was caught, and he was not planning on getting caught. All of the books he'd been reading told him how most killers were opportunists, and the only reason they'd been able to kill multiple people is because they'd been lucky. And he did not want to rely on luck. Quote, "I wasn't going to get caught because I was too smart. Just like my hero, Jack the Ripper, who killed and disappeared into the night without a trace. This was going to be me, and just as Jack did with his, I was going to leave my signature on each victim, and the more I killed, the more I would get my revenge on Alexander Rice." MacDonald would leave nothing to chance. He was already in very good physical condition, but he began to exercise more regularly, lift weights, and work on his cardio. He didn't smoke, he almost never drank, he was strong and could overpower and outrun the types of people that he was looking for as his victims. On occasion, he would go out with his bag packed and ready to kill, his demon urging him to commit another murder. But either he would sense some danger or the circumstances wouldn't be exactly right, and he wanted to remain careful. Sometimes the situation was perfect, but the overwhelming urge to kill someone would leave him. In these scenarios, he would simply go home, put away his bag, and wait until the next time the demon spoke to him. It was Monday the 20th of November 1961 when both the urge and circumstances combined, and MacDonald found his next opportunity for a brutal murder. He'd worked late the night before when, on Monday, he'd been woken up by his demon, the voice in his head telling him to kill. He packed a plastic bag, a new plastic raincoat, his knife, and some beer into his bag and headed out at about 7 p.m. He went to a few bars and hotels, but no one he'd seen looked right, and it was starting to get late. He thought he might have to just head home and come out another night, but as he walked back to his room at about 10:30 p.m., he saw a man walking in front of him. This man was Ernest Cobbins. MacDonald caught up with him and struck up a conversation. The man told him his name was Ernie. He'd been at a hotel listening to a fight on the wireless radio, but he hadn't been able to drink because he didn't have any money. MacDonald told Ernie that he was lonely, he wanted some company, and that he just happened to have 3 bottles of beer right there in his bag. Ernie asked him if he knew anywhere that they could go to drink without being seen by police. MacDonald suggested a nearby public toilet block. As they made their way there, Ernie told MacDonald that he was lonely too. He had been ever since his wife and children had left him. He missed them, but they wanted nothing to do with him. He didn't have any friends, he didn't have any work, and he relied on social security. He was exactly the type of person that MacDonald had been looking for. When they got to the toilets, MacDonald opened a beer for Ernie and one for himself. Ernie sat on one of the toilet seats and drank his beer while MacDonald watched him and drank his own. Ernie didn't seem to notice or care that MacDonald had reached into his bag and donned his plastic raincoat. The men chatted for about 20 minutes while they both finished their bottles of beer. There was no one around, and MacDonald's demon was screaming at him to commit the murder. As he reached into his bag, he told Ernie that he was just getting out the third bottle that they could share between them. But instead of taking out a beer bottle, MacDonald slid his knife out of its sheath. He brought the knife up quickly and stabbed it right through Ernest Cobbins' throat. Ernie jumped up and tried to grab MacDonald's hands to stop the attack, but MacDonald was able to overpower him. He stabbed him again and again in the throat and neck. Blood started to spurt out of the wounds, and MacDonald realized it had gone all over his face and hair. He became enraged at this and looked down at Ernest Cobbin, but once again his victim's face had turned into that of Alexander Rice. He saw the face of his tormentor smiling at him and taunting him, telling him to kill him if he could. In his own words, MacDonald went berserk. He inflicted stab wound after stab wound. He couldn't count how many there were. All he knew was that he stabbed the man until he was so physically exhausted that he couldn't thrust the knife in anymore. He wasn't done yet, though. As he'd said, he wanted to leave his signature on each of his victims. So he lowered Ernest Cobbin's pants and used his knife to remove his genitals. He then put them into the plastic bag that he'd brought with him and put that, the beer bottles, and the blood-soaked raincoat in his bag. He kept the knife out just in case someone came into the toilet block. Then he'd be ready for them. He walked out into the light rain and towards Moore Park to wash off his face. He then stowed the knife and headed home. It was just after 11 p.m., just as if he was walking home from work. No one saw him come home and walk quickly into the shared bathroom. He immediately locked the door and pulled out the plastic bag. For some reason that even MacDonald can't explain, he washed the body parts that he had removed from Ernest's body. When he'd finished cleaning them, he put them back into the plastic bag. Later, he said that after thinking about it for years, that he thought it must have been out of respect for the victim, but he really didn't know. He did know that there was no sexual aspect to it. I mean, I don't know, out of respect, maybe just don't murder and mutilate people. But that's just me. He washed the rest of the blood off himself and went to bed. The next morning he wrapped the plastic bag and its contents, the raincoat, the knife, and the brick that he'd found, packed it up into newspaper, and threw it off the waterfront at Circular Quay. At 5:35 the next morning, Constable Albert Fury received a phone call. A muffled voice told him that there was a murdered man in the Moore Park toilet. When police entered the public toilet building, Cobbins' body was propped up against the wall. There was blood everywhere, and the extreme violence that Ernest Cobbin had suffered was evident. The post-mortem indicated that he had been stabbed over 50 times. One of the stab wounds in the neck had gone in one side and come out the other. 3 of the stab wounds had penetrated the rib cage and hit the lungs. Most of the wounds had been concentrated on the head, neck, and shoulders. And of course, there were no genitals on the body. Most of the groin area had been removed, including the pubic hair and skin. Ernest Cobbin's brother, Roy Alfred Cobbin, identified the body as that of his brother. Roy told the authorities that his brother wouldn't hurt a fly. He had been down on his luck since his wife had left him and took his children, and he had taken to drinking. He had lived in parks and shelters, and because of his alcohol consumption, it had made him unreliable, and he'd struggled even to get casual labouring jobs. Lying dead, cold and mutilated in the morgue, it was the first time that Roy had seen his brother in months. The local press pounced on the murder, immediately noticing the similarities between the two killings. Being the early 60s, it was not proper for them to include intimate details of the mutilation in print, but they noted that both men had similar personal backgrounds, that they both had been stabbed a minimum of 40 times, that they had both been killed at around midnight while it was raining lightly, and that both men had been mutilated after death. Police investigations were ramping up. They focused particularly on spots frequented by the homeless or slums where drunk men would sleep for the night. They really wanted to find the person who had made the phone call because they thought it might have been their killer. They listed a warning in the paper on the 21st of November alerting the public to the danger of another attack and asking for any information about Ernie Cobbin. Now, a man named Percy Nicholson entered the Criminal Investigation Branch offices and asked to speak to a detective. He said that he had gone in to use the toilet at about 5:30 on the morning after Ernie had been killed. He'd walked in and he'd seen the mutilated body. He saw the stab wounds. He saw the blood covering the cubicle. He had run straight back out and called the police to tell them that there was a murdered man. He hid nearby and watched the police arrive, but he didn't show himself because he didn't want to get involved. But when he'd seen the newspaper report that stated that there had been another victim killed in the same manner, probably by the same person, he thought he should come forward, if only to clear himself as a suspect. Police and detectives questioned Percy, but he was quickly eliminated as their killer. They were convinced that the murder of Ernest Cobbin was the second in what would end up being a string of some sort of ritualistic serial murders if they didn't catch the killer as quickly as possible. Police patrolled the streets day and night. Officers posed as homeless men, hoping to catch whoever was mutilating people. Criminal records were being scoured for anyone who'd been released from prison in the last 6 months that had displayed the same homicidal tendencies. Sports and weapons stores were being canvassed, police hoping that anyone who had bought a knife had maybe given even the slightest hint about what they'd be using it for. Not sure why you'd tell a shopkeeper that you were going to use it for murder. Police did have theories about who was doing this to the men in the city. They concluded that perhaps he was a medical or anatomy student or even a doctor because of the removal of the body parts. But after investigating the actual incisions, they concluded that it could equally have been an abattoir worker or a butcher. They had no leads on yet another murder. They didn't find a murder weapon. There were, again, no fingerprints. No one had seen anything, and they still had not located Ernest Cobbin's missing body parts. They had searched the park, the toilets, and the surrounding areas thoroughly, but hadn't been able to find anything. Psychiatrists questioned why the murderer had disposed of the first set of genitals but had taken the next set with him. Was he taking trophies now? Police made the comparison that William MacDonald had always hoped for. They started referring to the killer as Sydney's Jack the Ripper, a phantom who came and went as he pleased, murdering and mutilating men to fulfill some violent and twisted desire, and then simply disappearing into the night. While police were organising additional officers and arranging undercover operations on the streets, William MacDonald was being heavily disappointed with the lack of full coverage of the case. He was very unhappy that only smaller articles had been released about the murder. He went to work on the Wednesday and his co-workers were making lots of jokes about the second mutilated body. They had one particular joke about how the killer had left with his toolbox. MacDonald sometimes found it hard to comprehend that they were talking about him, but said that he was proud that they were. and that even if they didn't know that it was him who had done it, he loved being the center of attention. He relished in the spotlight, even if no one knew the spotlight was on him. It was when some of his co-workers asked where he'd been on his day off that he began to get paranoid, but it passed in a few days. His co-workers continued to discuss the brutal murder over the next week. A man that MacDonald worked closely with latched onto the similarities between the Ripper murders and what was happening in the city. MacDonald said, quote, "He was telling me that Sydney now has its own Jack the Ripper. I loved it. He was talking about me. I was enjoying being the Mutilator, as they were referring to me in the newspapers. I loved the anonymous notoriety that it gave me. I knew that I would definitely commit more murders." For the next couple of months, MacDonald's demons seemed to be satisfied, but his paranoia was growing by the day. He would snap at anyone for almost any reason, and when he had a go at one of his supervisors, it was suggested that he use the department's medical coverage to see a psychiatrist. The doctor he ended up seeing, Carl Radesky, made a report that stated that it was certain that his patient, who he knew as Allan Brennan, is an unusual personality, best described as schizoid. It was February of 1962 when the voice returned to MacDonald, urging him to find another victim. He was ready for it, and he went out to hunt. But police presence had dramatically increased, and so had police patrols. MacDonald had decided, because of the increased security at night, to forego his usual packed bag and instead wore his raincoat and had a smaller sheath knife in his pocket. And he'd also bought a bottle of wine instead of multiple bottles of beer because it was smaller to carry and less conspicuous. He had come across a man named William Carr and had taken him to a park bench and sat with him to drink the wine out of a brown paper bag. As MacDonald put his hand in his pocket and wrapped it around the handle of the knife, a police car pulled up opposite them. Two constables exited the vehicle and approached the men. They asked the men their names and dates of birth. William MacDonald gave them the name Allan Brennan and his actual birthday and address. When the men asked why they were being questioned, the constables told them that they were running a special patrol and were questioning everyone who they'd seen in parks at night. As William Carr, MacDonald's intended victim for the evening, was answering the officers' questions, MacDonald stood up and just said that he'd better be getting home. The officers simply assumed that the two men were drunks, sneaking sips of wine in the park, and left. MacDonald couldn't believe his luck. They'd come very close to catching him in the act, and he said later that if he'd been asked to submit to a search, he could have had the knife out and could have slit both of their throats within a matter of seconds, and then he would have turned on his drinking buddy, just to make sure that there were no witnesses. This close call was enough to drive off the demon telling MacDonald to kill, so he just walked home. It was only just over a month later when it seemed that MacDonald's demon came back with a vengeance. At 10:50 p.m. on the 31st of March, Reg Cornish and his wife were on their way home from visiting friends and were pushing their baby in the stroller along Campbell Street in Sydney. As they passed Little Burke Street, Reg looked down the small alley and was horrified to see what looked like a body lying near the gutter. He told his wife to stay put while he went for a closer look. He saw lots of blood. He didn't notice any wounds on the torso or the clothing, just lots of blood around the head. He did not stick around to find out where it was coming from. He did notice that the man was breathing, but only just, and that his pants were undone and slightly pulled down on the left. He took his wife and child home and rang the police. When he had reported the discovery to officers, he returned to the spot that he had seen the body. It had been less than 10 minutes since he'd first seen it, but when he got back, the body had been moved. It was still in the alley, but it was not in the same place that he'd seen it just minutes beforehand. He decided to go directly to the police station and get a sergeant to come down and investigate. At 11:10 p.m., 20 minutes after Reg Cornish had first seen the body, and not long after he'd left the police station, a man named Stephen Flegman was driving along Little Burke Street and almost ran over a body. He stopped and got out of his vehicle to see what he'd almost hit. When he approached the man's body, he saw the blood. It was on his face, his neck, and down his shoulders. His pants were now fully down, and his groin area was also bloody. Stephen Flegman immediately left to find a constable on patrol. When officers arrived on scene, they found the man dead, bleeding, and mutilated. He was bleeding heavily from the throat. There was no pulse, and of course, his entire genital area was missing. From personal papers in the man's pocket, police tracked down an acquaintance of his, Lawrence Hickson, and with the body covered in a sheet to prevent Lawrence from seeing the worst of the mutilation, he identified the man as Frank Gladstone McLean. He had known McLean for 11 years. They were good friends and had drunk a few beers with each other earlier that day, but Frank had been quite sober when they'd parted ways. Lawrence told officers that Frank was an unemployed labourer who survived week to week on an army pension. He had taken to drinking a lot more since his family had left him, but he was a good bloke and, like Alfred Greenfield, didn't have an enemy in the world. Frank Gladstone McLean had died of massive hemorrhaging from numerous gaping wounds to the neck. 2 large stab wounds had gone through his chin and tongue, indicating that the knife had been thrust upward with extreme force. His throat had been cut twice, and his jugular vein had been severed. He had been stabbed a total of 49 times in the face, neck, head, arms, chest, shoulders, and back. His genitals had been completely excised, including the surrounding flesh, and then he'd been left in the gutter to be found by passer-bys. The day that Frank McLean had been killed, William MacDonald had decided that he couldn't use the same tactics as he'd used before. His demon had come again, but it was dangerous to spend time getting to know his victims, or to take them to secluded spots, because that's where the police were looking. He needed to act earlier in the evening, carrying his bag and hunting as the hotels were closing, so that he just looked like another drunk heading home. He bought a new knife, packed it in his bag, and headed out to the hotels in the city. He went from one to another, having a small amount to drink, blending in with the Saturday evening crowd. It had been showering on and off, so he didn't look out of place in his new plastic raincoat. At about 10:30 p.m. he noticed a tall man staggering along the main road. The voice in his head was loud and yelling at him. He approached the man and noticed that he was very intoxicated, and told him that he had a bottle of wine in his bag and would be happy to share it. The man agreed, and MacDonald suggested that they slip into a nearby alley to avoid police detection. They walked together onto Little Burke Street, and MacDonald pulled out the bottle of wine and handed it to McLean. McLean unscrewed the top and took a long drink from the bottle. He then handed it back to MacDonald and leant back on the alley wall to light up a cigarette. William MacDonald screwed the top back on the bottle and reached down to place it back in his bag. As he did, he grabbed hold of the large knife he had concealed. As he stood back up, he violently thrust the knife upwards into Frank McLean's face. It went through the bottom of his jaw, his chin, and his tongue until it became lodged in the roof of his mouth. Frank started to fight. He lashed out, trying to punch MacDonald, but he had drunk so much and was already losing so much blood that he was too unsteady on his feet and couldn't land any blows on his attacker. MacDonald dropped the knife and hit McLean with his fist to try and knock him down, but this only seemed to make McLean fight harder. He wildly swung his arms and lunged at MacDonald, while blood was pouring out of his neck. It covered MacDonald's raincoat and the pavement underneath them. MacDonald landed another punch to McLean's face, and he finally dropped to the ground. MacDonald then picked the knife back up and began to violently stab McLean's neck. As he was in the middle of this rampage, he heard the sound of a baby crying nearby. He froze and listened. He could hear people talking. He had no other choice but to hide and hope that whoever it was didn't look down the narrow laneway. He grabbed his bag and hid behind a fence a few meters away from where his victim had been left. He watched as Reg Cornish came down the alleyway, saw him look at the body, and heard him tell his wife that the man was still breathing and that they should go to the police. As Reg Cornish walked away, MacDonald knew he had no time to spare. He dragged Frank McLean to a darker spot in the street by his arms. When he looked down into the face of the man he had attacked, he once again could only see the face of Alexander Rice. And what's more, Rice was laughing at him, telling MacDonald that he would never be able to kill him. This enraged MacDonald, and he set about stabbing everywhere he could get to. The face, neck, chest, everywhere. He then lifted up the man's shirt, lowered his pants, and used the blood-soaked knife to leave what was now his calling card, his signature. He removed the man's genitals and placed them, the knife, and the raincoat into the plastic bag he had brought with him. He then quickly walked down the opposite end of the street from where the husband, wife, and baby had been. It had only taken a couple of minutes from being interrupted to finishing the gruesome task that he had set out to complete. He got home only 15 minutes later. No one saw him arrive home, and no one had seen him in the alley. He hadn't known Frank McLean and had no connections to any of his other victims. He felt perfectly calm and safe about the whole thing. He set about cleaning himself up, washing his hands and soaking his bruised knuckles in water. Then, once again and inexplicably, he carefully washed the parts he had taken from Frank McLean in warm water. He then packed his trophies, the raincoat, the knife, and another brick in a newspaper, and the next morning he went and threw it off Sydney Harbour. When he went to work, his workmates once again were all talking about the latest mutilation murder. They were debating whether the killer was a deviant homosexual who coveted the trophies he took from his victims and performed sexual acts with them once he'd have returned home from his attacks. MacDonald just managed to suppress the urge to defend himself. Instead, he pretended to be disinterested in the conversation. But he still listened intently to what was being said, paranoid that he was going to be found out, but also relishing in the attention and the notoriety. The newspapers continued to be a source of disappointment for MacDonald. He wondered how many people he was going to have to kill before he got the appreciation that he felt he deserved. The write-ups and articles would always leave out the extent of the mutilation, and now they were suggesting from the removal of the men's privates that the killer was probably a woman. MacDonald found this suggestion insulting, for the public to think that it was a woman who had done this. He found himself wanting to walk into a police station and confessing to everything, just so that he could finally take credit for his handiwork. He managed to suppress this urge too. He knew he couldn't because he had come to enjoy the act of killing. Sure, the voice in his head was the reason he had started, but with every victim, he began to enjoy it more. 2 weeks after the murder of Frank McLean, a man named Patrick Leo Royan reported that he had been attacked by a knife-wielding man just after midnight. Royan had walked down Goulburn Street when a man jumped out of a tree over a fence and lunged at him with a butcher's knife. Royan, a Royal Air Force mechanic, fought desperately and managed to land several punches to the attacker's face before he was able to run away. He ran to a telephone box on Campbell Street, barricading the door shut while he frantically called for police. He was in such a state of terror that when police arrived, he held the door shut, terrified that the attacker had come to find him. When police eventually managed to convince him it was safe, Royan told them of his ordeal. He told them that he was sure that he'd left marks on the attacker's face because he was wearing a metal splint on his right hand to help heal a broken finger, and he'd hit the man with that hand, jabbing the pointed end of the splint into the man's face. He was taken to the police station and given hundreds of photographs to look through. He had already given a detailed description of what his attacker looked like, and was able to identify the man in one of the photos shown to him. Police finally had a suspect, and he was well known around the area. Witnesses around the areas where both Alfred Greenfield and Ernest Cobbins were killed said that they had seen a man resembling the suspect in the areas at the time. New South Wales Police launched one of the biggest manhunts in Australia. Meanwhile, the homeless population lined up around the block to try and secure places in homeless shelters, staying in pairs, keeping away from parks, dark places, and public toilets. Locksmiths were booked out for weeks installing new deadbolts and heavy padlocks on almost every dwelling. Dog pounds and pet stores had run out of dogs, as residents and business owners rushed to increase their personal security with guard dogs. Police officers were pulled off almost every other case to become involved for the search for the mutilating murderer haunting their city. Hundreds of anonymous calls were coming in, mostly hoaxes that involved men jumping from trees or backs of trucks or awnings or off of buildings. He was carrying a knife or an axe or a machete or even a shotgun. He was bald or he had long hair. He was nude or wearing a cape, and his eyes dripped with blood. A week after the attack on Patrick Royan, police finally picked up the man that he'd identified as his attacker. But the man they picked up had an incredibly watertight alibi, and they would need more evidence to arrest him. To their dismay, on the 18th of July 1962, Royan would finally confess to police that he'd never been attacked. The wounds that they had seen on him when he called were self-inflicted. If they had looked closer into Royan's medical history, they may have found out earlier that he had a psychiatric disorder which had caused him to have intense attention-seeking behavior. It would later be classified as histrionic personality disorder. Police had wasted a week looking for an innocent man based on the information and description given to them by Royan. He had caused officers to launch a nationwide search for an attacker that wasn't real. Royan ended up being sentenced to 18 months in prison for his lie, and the police were back to square one. William MacDonald knew when he heard the story of Royan being attacked that it was all a big hoax, but the story had brought the murders back to the front page, and he was very happy about that. He was finally getting more recognition in the media. He wasn't too happy with the description of the man they were looking for, but he said, quote, "What could I do? I couldn't ring up and complain about it." As he walked the streets in Darlinghurst, he was amazed by the terror that he had exacted on the city. He did feel sorry for the homeless men, now all out in the cold instead of in public parks or toilet buildings, but he told himself again that it wasn't really him. It was the demon causing all of the pain. But he said, quote, "I had to admit that I loved committing murder." He would also say that it boiled down to the fact that this was all Alexander Rice's fault. If Rice hadn't raped him, then none of it would have happened. He knew that he would continue to commit murder, but not for the time being. He would try to resist the voice that told him to kill because it was even more dangerous now to be seen roaming the streets looking for his next victim. Besides, all of the media and publicity seemed to have pacified the demon, for now. Over the next few months, he still went for nightly walks, but he left behind his kill bag. He knew that he needed a different plan for when the demon came to him again. He needed to be able to kill and mutilate his future victims in private. His paranoia had been growing for months, and to make matters worse for him, his shifts at work had been changed back, so he was once again working with Aubrey Belts. He had tried to fight Belts a couple more times, and he was also under the false impression that all of his colleagues somehow knew of his sexual orientation and were all laughing about him behind his back. A man named Cecil Hepper had also moved into his building and had been trying to become friends with MacDonald, asking him about his childhood and where he'd come from, and consistently peeking out of his door to try and catch MacDonald on his way in or out. MacDonald did not think this was a good thing, especially if he wanted to hunt again. He decided that it was time to move on. He looked through the paper and found a butcher shop and residence for sale for a reasonable price. It was located in the middle of a busy suburb called Concord, and it wasn't far from the city. A butcher shop seemed like a good purchase. It wouldn't look strange if he had blood on his clothes, and with the residence attached, it would give him plenty of space and privacy for his intended use. He handed in his notice at the mail sorting department, and as he collected his final paycheck, he vowed that he would come back and kill Aubrey Belts at some point in the future. He spent a week training and learning the business from the previous owners, and on Halloween, Wednesday the 31st of October 1962, he took over the shop and moved his few possessions into the apartment above it. As soon as the shop opened for business, MacDonald realized that he was in trouble. He had no idea what he was doing. He didn't know how to operate a cash register. He had no idea how to cut meat properly. He hated having to deal with customers, and he had no clue where anything was kept. He spent a few days blundering through, all the while the demon had started up again. He said that it must have known he had a private premises, so it had come back louder and more persistent than ever. By Saturday, he was going out of his mind with the urge to kill again. When the shop closed at 6 that evening, he headed into the city. He didn't need to take his kill bag with him. He could now lure his victims back to the shop. He had plenty of weapons available and had even bought a new knife just for the occasion. He had a few drinks at a few pubs in the city, but hadn't found a suitable victim. He moved on to a wine bar and at about 9 p.m. struck up a conversation with a man who seemed highly intoxicated. He told the man that he had a place they could go and drink more, and the man agreed to go back to Concord with him. MacDonald bought a few bottles of beer from the hotel and they took a cab. On the way back to MacDonald's house, the man told him his name was John McNulty and that he'd just been released from Long Bay Jail. He was originally from Ireland but had moved to Australia. None of his family were here, and being recently released, he didn't have any friends either, and he was glad for the company. MacDonald, while listening to this, could only think how lucky it was that he'd managed to find a victim who wouldn't be missed. MacDonald made sure to hide his face in the collar of his jacket for most of the ride home in case the driver could identify him later, and got the driver to drop them off around the corner from his shop instead of out the front. They also entered the premises via the back alley to not be seen entering through the front door. It was 9:30 p.m. by the time they got inside. The men sat and drank a bottle of beer each. McNulty then set about drinking a third bottle. but he had already been so drunk that he only got halfway through it before he decided that he was too warm and took off his coat. He then told MacDonald that it was getting quite late, and would MacDonald mind if he'd stayed there the night instead of trying to get home. MacDonald, of course, didn't mind at all. McNulty passed out on the floor of MacDonald's bedroom. MacDonald knew that he didn't need to rush this time. He cleaned up the beer bottles, got the new knife out that he'd purchased, and he sat on a chair drinking the last of the beer that they had as he looked down at the man that he was about to brutally murder. The more he watched McNulty, the more his victim's face changed into the face of Alexander Rice. MacDonald watched him for about half an hour, while the voice in his head became a scream, enraging MacDonald to the point of absolute madness. He knelt down over McNulty, raised the knife, and brought it down into the man's throat. In his haste, he missed at the jugular vein and hit the side of the man's neck instead. McNulty woke up, and even though he was drunk, he managed to roll over onto his back and grab MacDonald's arm. MacDonald continued to try and stab at McNulty, and in his frenzied state ended up stabbing himself in the hand. There was blood everywhere, but the wound to MacDonald's own hand infuriated him, and he unleashed a furious, frenzied assault on the innocent man lying on the bedroom floor. When McNulty was finally still and MacDonald could see clearly that he was dead, instead of stopping, MacDonald continued stabbing the man until again he was too exhausted to even raise the knife. When he looked around the room, he saw blood covering the bed, massive pools of it on the linoleum floor, splatters over the walls, and even drops of it on the ceiling. There was a large gaping wound between his thumb and index finger where he'd cut himself, and blood was pouring from his own hand. He wrapped up his hand in a dirty dishcloth and went back to the body to perform his usual mutilation. As he tried to slice off the man's genitals, he realized the knife was too blunt, and he only managed to get halfway through when, from exhaustion, he actually fell asleep in a pool of blood beside McNulty's body. He woke up about an hour and a half later, around midnight. He tried to get up, but the blood under him had started to congeal, and so it started bringing up the linoleum floor tiles with him. There was dried and sticky blood everywhere. His hand was still bleeding, so he ran water over it and tied another cloth around it. He went back to the bedroom and undressed McNulty, and then dragged him into another room so that he could clean up the mess he'd made. But not until the morning. He was tired. After he'd moved the body, he got into bed and slept for 7 hours, with blood all over the room and a dead man in the room next to him. At 7 a.m. the next morning, he woke up, showered, and got dressed. He knew he had to deal with the blood and the body that was in his apartment, but instead he called a cab and took himself to the local hospital. After all, he had cut his hand, the poor baby. Once he'd had his hand fixed up, he went back to McNulty. He dragged the body down the stairs and took it as far as he could up into the foundations beneath the building. He then went back and peeled the entirety of the linoleum flooring from his apartment. He broke it all up and placed it under the building with the body. He scrubbed the walls and the floors. He stripped the bedding and put it, along with his clothes, McNulty's clothes, and the linoleum from the stairs, all under the building with the rest of the evidence. He then went back to the body and dragged it further into the foundations, through a large hole in the brickwork and into a small crawl space. He then caught the train to Circular Quay, where he threw the murder weapon, the new knife, into the harbour, just as he'd done with all of the previous knives. He knew what he needed to do now. He walked for a long time. He realised that he'd made a big mistake using his own residence. In his haste and fury, he'd killed a man and stashed him under his own home. When McNulty was found, he would be revealed as the serial killer that had been terrorizing Sydney. He went home and he packed his personal belongings into a bag. The next morning, Monday the 5th of November, he put a sign on his shop window saying that the shop would be closed for a month, and he went to the Central Railway station. He booked a ticket to Brisbane for the following evening. He withdrew his remaining savings from the bank and used a locker to stash his things for the night. He went to the movies for the rest of the day and drank at various bars that night. He went back to his home and went to bed before getting up early the next morning. There was one more thing that he wanted to do before he left town. He wanted to kill Aubrey Belts. He bought a new knife and waited at a restaurant. He knew Belts usually walked across the road from work to a park to eat his lunch. All MacDonald had to do was wait and follow him. But Belts never came. Aubrey Belts would later say that he didn't know why he didn't follow his usual routine that day, but he was very lucky he didn't. Otherwise, he would have become MacDonald's next victim. MacDonald knew that his time had run out. He couldn't go looking for Belts, so he threw the knife into a bin and headed to the station to catch his train. He spent a couple of months in Brisbane, making sure that he was buying all of the Sydney newspapers to keep an eye on any word about the discovery of McNulty's body. He saw nothing, but that did not stop his paranoia from reaching critical mass. He was scared that any day a knock would come at his door and he would be caught. He decided that he needed to get further away. At the time, travel between Australia and New Zealand did not require a passport, so under a different assumed name, MacDonald caught a flight to Wellington. He worked as a labourer for a couple of months, but the voice in his head, his demon, was back and was urging him to kill again. One night the temptation became too great, and although he didn't have a knife, he was resigned to using any method he could. He met a man and they walked together to a park to have a drink. As they drank, MacDonald put his hands around the man's neck and started to choke him. As the man started losing consciousness, the urge just suddenly left him again, and he released the man. He ran back to his boarding house. He was scared and he thought for sure that the man would report the crime and he would be picked up. He kept an eye on all of the papers, but there was never any mention of the attack. By the time April 1963 came around, MacDonald was overcome by the demon again, and he decided he would take the enormous risk of going back to Sydney. He said, quote, "Although the demon was constantly at me to kill, I suppose ego also had a lot to do with me going back to Sydney." He still didn't know what had become of McNulty, but Sydney had been the only place where he'd been able to kill numerous times, get away with it, and get the attention he deserved in the papers and with the public. He had grand dreams and fantasies of seeing the newspaper headlines announcing that there had been another Mutilator murder. He returned to Sydney on the 17th of April, and over the next few days he roamed the streets, booked hotel rooms under different names, bought a new knife, and waited for the urge to overwhelm him. 5 days after he'd arrived, he was walking down George Street when he bumped into John McCarthy, who would end up reporting to the police and the media that he had spoken to a walking corpse. What William MacDonald had missed in the Sydney newspapers on November of the previous year was his own obituary. On the 19th of November 1962, a produce store owner had reported to the health board that there was a foul odour coming from the block of shops where he had his business. The real estate agents for the premises had also been called on complaints from neighbours about the same disgusting smell coming from the butcher shop. A health inspector was admitted to the shop by a real estate agent accompanied by a council employee. The smell was overwhelming, a rotting, rancid stench that couldn't even be helped by covering the men's mouths and noses with their handkerchiefs. They found a small opening in the building's foundations, which led to a square opening about 4 foot high in the brick. When they shone a torch into it, they saw the heavily decomposing body of a person. It was lying on its back, apparently naked except for its socks. It was decaying and riddled with ants and maggots. They ran out from under the house and called police right away. Officers arrived and inspected the scene. There were no drag marks near the body, and the person's clothes, men's clothing, had been folded neatly and placed next to the dead man. The officers arranged to have the body moved to the morgue while they inspected the shop and apartment above. There were bloodstains on the floor and in the kitchen. Under the clean sheets on the bed, the mattress was stained with blood. There were specks of blood on the pillow, and a lot of the lino flooring had been peeled off the ground. The post-mortem was conducted in a shed away from the general admission area and sick wards of the hospital because the smell and decomposition of the body had been so bad. Because the body had decomposed so much and much of the flesh had been eaten off the face, neck, and chest, medical examiners could find no wounds that would suggest any foul play. The face was completely unrecognizable. There were no fractures or displacement of the bones, as far as they could tell. Apart from being badly decomposed and attacked by maggots, the heart, lungs, liver, bowels, stomach, and genitals were all intact. Yes, the medical examiner ruled that the genitals were fully intact. He could find no evidence or sign that the man had been murdered, but could not extend his opinion on any cause of death. The detectives had managed to secure a small portion of fingerprints from 3 of the dead body's fingers, but due to the small size and faintness, they weren't surprised when they didn't come up with any matches. A neighbour, Mr. Osborne, was shown photographs of the deceased's teeth, and he told officers that they looked the same as the man who had recently taken over the premises, Allan Edward Brennan. Detectives decided that the dead man must be Brennan, who had taken his own life in some strange naked ritual, or who'd been exploring the foundations and had hit his head. Why he would have removed all his clothes while doing this was anyone's guess. No relatives could be found and no friends came forward, because Allan Brennan had no friends, and of course he didn't have any family because he didn't really exist. The coronial inquest into Brennan's death was left at an open finding. The district coroner, S.E. Cox, was puzzled by a number of factors. The fact that the man was naked, the location that he was found in, the lack of cause of death, the fact that he was only identified as Brennan by a neighbour being shown a picture of a set of teeth. He closed the inquest by saying that he could not categorically rule out the possibility of foul play. And then, 2 months later, he was proven right when Allan Edward Brennan returned to Sydney. When McCarthy had convinced a reporter to write headlines about the discovery of a dead man walking around in the city, the CIB were forced to take a close look at what they had assumed to be the discovery of Allan Brennan's body. The superintendent requested the case to be reopened, and the complete ineptitude of the first investigation finally came to light. When they inspected the actual foundations again, they found the blood-stained bed linen and linoleum pieces, which had both somehow been missed on the first investigation. On closer inspection of the clothes that were found with the body, detectives saw that the shirt had 27 holes in it, which looked like they had been made by knife wounds. Police also found pencil-drawn numbers on the label of the suit jacket and trousers, which detectives discovered had been put there by prison officials at the Long Bay jail when an inmate arrived wearing the suit, a man by the name of Patrick Joseph Hackett. Patrick Hackett had a few aliases. He was also known as John Hackett, Patrick Huguet, John Doherty, and John McNulty. When the fingerprints were examined the first time, they hadn't produced a match, but with the new evidence, officers worked around the clock to perfect a human glove made from the original prints. When compared to those of Joseph Patrick Hackett, aka John McNulty, they were a perfect match. The man resting in the grave marked Allan Brennan was Patrick Hackett. So where was Brennan? It was suspicious to everyone involved that he hadn't come forward, especially since finding out that he was supposedly dead. But because they still hadn't found any evidence of mutilation, they only wanted to find Brennan because of the mystery. He was not even connected to the other murders in the city. He wasn't even a suspect. The papers released sketches of Brennan, images of him and the shop that he'd bought. The walking corpse was national news. Meanwhile, MacDonald had fled to Melbourne, but he could not escape the manhunt. Melbourne papers had his face on them, and police were now offering a £5,000 reward for his apprehension. MacDonald dyed his hair, grew out his moustache, and used another name. He was paranoid to the extreme. He jumped if anyone spoke to him, scared that they were going to recognize him. The police had still not heard from anyone who knew of Brennan's whereabouts, and so they decided to try another method for releasing a likeness of him. With help from Brennan's former work colleagues, they released Australia's first ever identikit or composite sketch, which, instead of someone describing Brennan, police showed drawings of different facial features and composed a full face from the features that most matched Brennan's likeness. Every capital city was sent the identikit portrait, and every paper in the country plastered it right on the front page. Two young workers on Melbourne's Spencer Street Railway had been discussing among themselves that the first sketch they had seen of Allan Brennan looked very similar to the man who had just started working with them a few days earlier. Now, when they mentioned this to their supervisor, he just told them that they'd obviously just been watching too much TV and to get back to work. Plus, there was this weird regulation that workers were prohibited from calling the police at any time while on shift without permission from the Commissioner of Railways. I have absolutely no idea why this was a rule and can't find out for the life of me why this was necessary, but it basically meant that the two boys weren't able to do anything about their suspicions. However, a week later, when the identikit portrait was released, there was no doubt in their minds that the man they were looking at on the front page was David Allan, the man who had started working with them a couple of weeks earlier. They decided to break the rules and they contacted police, informing them that they believed they had found the man that everyone was looking for. Police put David Allan under surveillance for 1 day before apprehending him when he went to the railway office to collect his paycheck. They arrested him and they put him under armed guard. When he spoke to the officers, he didn't make up any stories. He didn't hide who he was. He told them that he was the Allan Edward Brennan that they had been looking for, and that his real name was William MacDonald. He told them point blank that he had murdered who he knew as McNulty, and that he had hidden the body in the foundations of his shop, and then he had left town. Police were stunned. They were not expecting a confession of this nature, but it was nothing to how they felt when MacDonald spoke next. He went on to tell them that he was also responsible for the Sydney Mutilation Murders. MacDonald said that he was glad to have been caught, that he'd been jumping at his own shadow. The demon was driving him insane and he'd been in a living hell, and he was glad that it was all over. Detectives immediately rang the Sydney police to inform them of MacDonald's confession. He did not oppose his extradition to New South Wales and was escorted by detectives to the airport, where he was placed on a plane back to Sydney. In the police car on the way to police headquarters, he was officially charged with the murders of Alfred Greenfield, Ernest Cobbins, and Frank McLean. While he had also admitted to the murders of Amos Hurst and John McNulty, both of those deaths had not been ruled homicides, and so he could, at this particular time, only be charged with 3 murders. He was sent to Long Bay Jail to await his hearings. He was kept away from other prisoners, which suited him just fine. The demons still came to him, but there was nothing that he could do to satisfy it from his cell, so he spent time reading books from the library and was allowed to purchase a radio, so listened to his classical favourites while he sat waiting. While he was waiting, a second inquest was held into the death of Hackett, aka McNulty, and from the ridiculous amount of evidence that had been overlooked in the first investigation, it was ruled that McNulty had been murdered, and MacDonald was to be charged, and that disciplinary action would be taken against those officers involved in the initial investigation. A solicitor visited MacDonald in his cell and told him that he was being charged with 4 murders, and that if he were to plead guilty, then it would all be over very quickly. MacDonald was happy to comply. He knew that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, and he didn't really care. But of course, when there are high-profile and intriguing cases, there are vultures, and this case's vulture was a man by the name of Jack Burney, who was one of Sydney's leading Queen's counsels. He made a visit to MacDonald and told him that he would represent him free of charge. All MacDonald would have to do would be to sign a contract giving Burney exclusive rights to the story, which he would sell to the newspaper for a huge sum of money, and then would give MacDonald some of that money. MacDonald thought that the arrangement sounded pretty good, so he signed, and that's when Burney convinced him to plead not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Of course, Burney knew that there was no way of keeping MacDonald out of some kind of prison, but if he pled not guilty, it would mean extending the trial by a long time, which is exactly what he wanted. The longer the trial went, the better the story, and the more money he would make. Burney arranged for leading psychiatrists to examine MacDonald for the defense. MacDonald told them all about his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, the asylum he was sent to, the shock treatments that he was subjected to 5 days a week for 6 months, the rape he suffered at the hands of the corporal, and the demon that screamed at him inside his head. He avoided speaking in detail about his family so that he couldn't be traced back to them, but he was open and honest about everything else because he hoped that he could be cured. MacDonald appeared with Jack Burney for his 4 committal hearings, where MacDonald, true to his word, pled not guilty. The Director of Public Prosecutions decided that it was safer, cheaper, and less time-consuming to try MacDonald for 1 murder, and if they didn't get a conviction, they had 3 more they could try him for. They decided that the most evidence they had and their best chance of conviction was the murder of Patrick Hackett/John McNulty. While back in jail awaiting trial, Amos Hurst's body was exhumed and examined to see if detectives could confirm that he had indeed been murdered. But by that time the body was only bones, and no new evidence could support MacDonald's confession. William MacDonald's trial started on the 23rd of September 1963. It was said that MacDonald would have looked more at home in an accounting firm than on trial for a brutal and violent murder and mutilation. When asked to enter his plea, MacDonald stood up, calmly pled not guilty, and sat back down. The prosecution then read the full confession and statement that he'd given to Melbourne police when he'd been picked up, that outlined in excruciating detail the murder, mutilation, and concealment of Patrick Hackett. When the prosecutor had finished reading the confession, the entire gallery was stunned. They all found it hard to reconcile that this small, timid man was the same one that had stabbed Hackett 41 times, mutilated his dead body, and then hidden him under the foundations, only to be found weeks later. The following day, Jack Burney stood to defend his client. He told the court that while there was no doubt that his client did commit this horrific crime, he could not be held responsible because he was insane at the time. He called both of the psychiatrists that had examined MacDonald in the prison. Both of the doctors labelled MacDonald as certifiably insane. They both agreed that at the moment of the murder of each of MacDonald's victims, he could not discern the difference between right and wrong. He was and had been suffering from faulty and defective reasoning, and not only was he medically insane, he was also legally insane. They said that while he was in his state of fury caused by the voice in his head, he was unable to control his actions and did not realize that what he was doing was wrong. Once that acute phase had passed, however, like many other certifiably insane patients, he realized what he had done and took steps to escape detection and capture. The judge, Justice Clements, began his summing up by addressing the jury, telling them that they had two decisions to make. The first was to decide if William MacDonald had committed the murder, which had been admitted by both the defendant and his counsel, and was also supported by the evidence. The second decision they had to make was if MacDonald was criminally responsible for his actions when he killed Patrick Hackett. He made mention of the doctor's testimonies and that they had diagnosed MacDonald as mentally ill and that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He reminded the jury that the Crown had not disputed the fact that MacDonald was so affected by his condition that he did not know at the time that killing Hackett was wrong. On the 24th of September, the jury retired. Less than 2 hours later, they returned at 2:08 p.m. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty as charged. It was a verdict that shocked the courtroom, the public, the defense, and even some members of the prosecution. William MacDonald was clearly insane. But the jury took into account the fact that MacDonald had taken steps and measures to conceal his actions. He had made sure not to leave any fingerprints. He had taken away any items that would lead back to him. He concealed his weapons, the raincoats, and the trophies that he had removed from his victims. He had run from state to state, even another country, and he had changed his name numerous times. He had some idea that what he'd been doing was wrong, but he kept doing it. Justice Clements handed William MacDonald a sentence of a lifetime of penal servitude. He would die in prison. He was sent to Long Bay Jail to serve out his sentence, but it wasn't long before his anger and rage started to show. He thought at one point another prisoner was making fun of him, so he took his mop and bucket and almost beat the man to death. He was transferred to solitary confinement until a psychiatrist could be brought in to examine him. When the doctors came, they confirmed that he was certifiably insane and he was transferred to Callan Park Mental Hospital, a maximum security facility. From there, he was sent to Morisset Asylum for the Criminally Insane. In Morisset, he was frequently badgered by other inmates for not socializing, not wanting to talk to anyone, and for spending all of his time in his bare cell. MacDonald said, quote, Fortunately, I was sedated, otherwise I would have tried to kill someone or other almost every day in those early years. It took me about 2 years to settle in. MacDonald spent 16 years in Morisset on constant medication for most of the time. Eventually, he was weaned off the drugs that kept the demon quiet, and while still unsociable, introverted, and private, the voice was no longer in his head. In November of 1979, MacDonald was told that he was cured, and he was being transferred out of the asylum and back to maximum security prison. It was in the Goulburn prison that he earned the name the Knack Man. Other prisoners joked that when he killed his victims, he would cut off their knickknacks, slang for their genitals, or else he would nick their knacks. It got to the point where even guards and officers were calling him Knick-Knack. He was moved once more to the Cessnock medium security prison, where he spent his days pacing his cell, watching the small rented television and listening to classical music on the radio. William MacDonald was never paroled, and he never wanted to be. He didn't mind being in a cell and liked to spend most of his time alone. MacDonald, born Allan Ginsberg, became the longest-serving prisoner in New South Wales history. He was sent to prison in 1963, and he never came out. At 8:20 a.m. on Tuesday the 12th of May 2015, he died of apparent natural causes in the secure annex of the Prince of Wales Hospital in New South Wales. His failing health had required him to be transferred there. He was 90 years old. None of his victims deserved what he put them through. They had been down on their luck, that maybe they'd drunk a little too much that night, or they'd trusted the wrong people. But all they'd done is been in the wrong place at the wrong time. May Amos Hurst, Alfred Greenfield, Ernest Cobbins, Frank McLean, and Patrick Hackett continue to rest in peace. And hopefully their families, even though estranged, got some comfort in the fact that MacDonald, unlike other perpetrators of gruesome murders, was never allowed to see the outside of a prison. But, my friends, that's it. That is the case of the walking corpse, Sydney's Mutilation Murders, the Knick-Knack Man. I will be back soon with more Australian true crime, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.